The Saga of ShaHaNon, Book 2, Emperors and Exiles, Chapter 1, Guests. Ivan dropped the massive armload of thistlebrush just inside the wall. He grabbed the heavy bone ring handle and pulled the gate closed. A storm was moving in, and he was glad to be home. He shook the snow from the fur of the great coat. Via shook hard to try to free herself from the snow as well before she headed to the central fire. Ivan's small herd of tundra sheep shifted around but slept for the most part. The ram opened his eyes to look at Ivan as the big man added peat to the fire, then drifted back to sleep. It was safe and warm in the tall, walled yard Ivan had built in front of his small hut. The sheep tolerated being his herd for the shelter and the food that he provided them over the bitter cold winter. He got milk and wool and sometimes meat for his care. He did not herd them as humans herded their sheep. These sheep came and went as they wished. All Ivan had needed to do was to steal and raise a few of the lambs, and the herd was his. He moved to the brew that was built into the hill at the back of the yard. Once inside the door, he lifted off the heavy fur cloak. He had taken the hide from the great wild dog that the Azirans called the Icehound. It was the size of a northern troll, and was known to stalk and kill entire villages, one soul at a time. Ivan had not wanted to kill the rare and powerful creature, but it had turned its attention to him. He had no choice but to take it down, and it had given him much in way of useful items. The fact that he had found the bones of men in its belly had made him feel much better about killing it. Still, it was a rare creature, both smart and powerful. Now its fur kept him warm and made his bed deep and soft. He picked off a little ice that clung to the deep, thick fur and grabbed up the matching vest that he wore at home. Belting it on, he moved to the hearth to pour himself a little cup of bitter root and rosehip tea before he ducked back outside. Via, who lay by the fire in the enclosure, looked up and grunted. Ivan loved his only companion. She was a massive gray dog, native to Azir. Packs of them were kept to hunt trolls, but Ivan had only the one. He had found her as a starving puppy out on the tundra with no idea how she had gotten there. He had gathered her up in his arms without hesitation and carried her for days before she could even walk. She had healed from her starvation and from her wounds, likely from a bear of some sort, and she had become his second set of eyes. She rarely slept at the fire with the sheep unless Ivan was gone. Tonight, though, she took up her post as guardian. He had been out later than he had wanted and could not shake an unease that she seemed to feel as well. He had gone out only in hope of finding some source of food to add to his dwindling stores, but there had been nothing larger than ice foxes and snow hares. This time of year the sun did come up over the horizon, but not for long, and it was soon down and gone. He had been forced to leave off his hunt to get back to shelter. It was dark, and Ivan felt like he was being hunted himself. Not only that, but a storm had begun to blast in from the west, off the ice fields of the glacier called Grunda Havanhar, the Deadly Mother. She had been growing the last few centuries, pushing down into the lower hills, spreading her icy fingers out into the silt fields at her foot and beyond, reaching out into the pasture lands. Massive sections fell away, crushing down, smashing into new mountain ranges of ice. Her unrelenting power pushed her own creations forward and under her. Beneath her great weight was a battlefield that haunted Ivan, even today. He was glad for her to have overtaken and consumed the site. If she ever fell back, the hills would be wiped away and the ground ever changed. The bones of those buried there would be dust under her passing. Ivan left his small bro. He had built it out of packed clay, mud, and willow. The mix was pounded into walls as hard as stone. It was not large, but it was solid, and it held the heat of his small hearth well. He had a bed against the wall at the right, to the east. His bed was always to the east. It was a deep box built of timbers he had hauled almost 50 miles. He had filled its depth with feathers of the white geese that summered on the silt fields below Grunda. On that, he layered his furs. He had his hearth to the west with a single small round window that would mark the passing season as the sun set and cast a beam of light across the walls. The back wall had a single shelf with his few possessions. He had a couple bowls, mortar and pestle, several little cups, a jar holding his cooking spoons, and stack of pots that fit into each together. There were a few battered old books and a small plain box that held his rings in a hidden base. Herbs and rose limbs hung from the ceiling, and his teapot stayed always at the hearth. His daily weapons hung on the wall beside the door, while his better weapons hid under his bed where no one would find them by chance. His only seat was the hearth step. It was stone, made warm by the fire that burned always. Next to his great ice-hound cloak was an old cloak that was battered, torn, and weather-stained. It looked dull, less than worthy, and yet it had its own peg. Easing himself down beside Via, he rubbed at her head a moment before he took a sip of the hot, bitter drink. The storm tonight felt uneasy. His senses prickled, and ghosts of the past whispered at him. He hid out here, alone, trying to make peace with his demons and his broken heart. He chuckled at the thought of that.
Demon!
He shook his head, thinking of ShaHaNon, not as a demon, but as a friend he missed greatly. He bowed his head and sent a prayer for the man's soul.
The rate I'm aging, I might well meet him again, you know,
he told his hound.
He and I have a lot in common, though I'd never say that to him. Don't look at me that way, we do.
He sighed sadly and pushed the haunting memories of his life as a young man away. Those memories were buried under Grunda and to history, but to his heart they lingered. He had fled Ezir for Dakan, shaved his head in exile, and turned his back to his people. At times he wished someone had been able to wipe those memories away, as ShaHaNon had tried to erase his memory of the time they had spent together. ShaHaNon had tried but had failed. So too would the attempt to wipe away the far past failure, so there was no reason to try. The magic had slipped, and memory had been restored. It had driven Ivan to desert the life he had been living and make his way back to the northern ice fields, the home of his youth. Once, Ivan had been a young man with a wife he adored, children that filled his heart, and friends all about him. Once, he had sat at the fires on nights like this and drank sweet ale and sang songs, played games, and celebrated all that it was to be an Aziran. Now, he sat alone and faced the pain he had fled from all those years ago. If he had not met ShaHaNon and known of ShaHaNon's pain, he would have returned to his life in Dakan. If ShaHaNon could deal with the pain he was in, then Ivan could face his own. That year with ShaHaNon and the group of misfits had changed Ivan so deeply in his heart, he knew that it had to be the will of the gods to have put him on that ship, on that day, with those others. That thought helped some days. Other days it did not. Ivan let his mind slip away to the past, and the so very distant memory of his children, the pain of his loss sadly more vivid than the recollection of their faces. In that respect, he feared that he and ShaHaNon shared a very similar fate. He stirred from distant places and thoughts, and went back inside to refill his cup. He lingered at the hearth, debating on cooking a meal or going to bed, when Via made a small woof of a sound. Something was here, not a threat, but too close for her comfort. Ivan shook the last of his thoughts away and went out to check on his dog's warning. In the middle of his yard, just on the other side of his fire pit, sat an old woman. She was filthy. Her hair was snarled with feathers and shells tied into its grimy length. She wore layers of leather, fur, and fabric. She had bits of battered herb bundles tied to her wherever she could, and she sat with her eyes closed. On her eyelids were painted great staring eyes, telling all who saw that she was a seer. Ivan had thought they were all hunted out. The church's persecution of the Azirans had been brutal, to say the least. Yet, there she sat.
"Come back from the wilds, have you?"
she asked without opening her eyes.
"Long you have hidden, but I have found you."
Bring you meat or thread?
He asked in the traditional way. One did not enter another's house without a gift to offer. That would be very rude. Even a seer would be asked to bring a gift of some sort. She grinned, showing she had had most of her teeth shattered into small spears. This woman had been beaten, and badly, at least once. It was more than just age, and he knew it. An Eziran could live 1,000 years, a seer or king even longer. but her scars were inflicted, that much he could see. So deep were they that he had no way to even guess at her true age.
A daughter does not need to bring gifts to her father's fire. She brings her company, and that is enough.
She opened her eyes to show they were scarred over. Ivan had seen such scars from the magic fires used to torture prisoners, burning their eyeballs, inflicting excruciating pain that would linger with them for life. She would be utterly blind. It was a tactic that Jerome favored for those who were family of the powerful, turning them into dependents, often beggars. He shook his head. The pain she had clearly endured was known to drive people insane. To have a blind old woman, seer or not, in his company made him uneasy, and to have a seer call him father was worse. It felt almost as if the gods were mocking his haunted loss.
Who are you, woman, and what are you doing in my hovel? You lost?
Lost? No, I'm not lost.
She paused, as if asleep a moment.
You should pull out the frozen meat and set it to the spit. You will have company soon. They will be hungry. Ready a blanket. The boy will be suffering from the cold.
He looked at her a long moment, not moving. He had meat frozen in the hill, of course, but it would be his meals for weeks to come. He had no desire to cook it. He also had no wish to have a strange woman with scars and the marks of a seer in his company. However, he was a very long way from anywhere, and to have anyone make it across the snowfields, through the recent storms and up the canyon, to where he had dug his hut into the hillside and hidden behind a wall, now buried in snowbanks, was unlikely. If she had made it even a day through glacier fields, storms, and wild beasts, either she was not alone, or it was the will of the gods, or both.